So yesterday I finally got my replacement 6500s back. I spent all afternoon yesterday and even into the night trying to get everything mounted back up onto the wall, rewired, get it all ready to go so that we can fire them back up. Now, before we look at some of the changes that I've made while I was waiting, let's look at some of the changes that are in these newer revisions of the 6500s. Before we jump into the actual hardware, I wanted to show two things that actually came in the packaging for the 6500s. So now, at least in the one that I received, it included a full-paged, updated revision of the manual, dated December 2022, and it's actually it's not regular paper. It's thicker. It's almost like it's not quite cardstock, but it's a little bit thicker, and I really like this. You know, I know you can get the downloaded copy, but having to look at that on the phone versus, you know, keeping the manual right next to your inverters, I prefer that, because then I don't always have to grab my phone to find the updated manual. But I know in the last one that I received, it was still getting shipped out with version 1.0 of the manual, and this one is version 2.3. So I'm glad that they're finally including the updated copy of the manual. They also included a USB to serial cable for connecting to your computer, because the cable that's included with your inverters is the Cat5 to serial. But in order to connect to your computer, you would have to buy your own USB to serial cable in order to plug it in for firmware updates, to view data on the software that comes with the inverter for your computer. So I'm glad that they're including these now in the packaging. In their later revisions of the 6500s, they replaced the terminal block. And I knew I had seen pictures of it. I've seen a few other videos of it. I knew that they had finally beefed this up, because the last block was really quite flimsy. You know, they recommended 6 to 4 gauge wire going into those terminals, and I'll try to put a comparison shot up here of the old one. But the old ones, you really had to fight to get a 4 gauge wire in. This block, the 4 gauge wire slides in perfectly. I mean, it's great. And then they've got these actual lugs here for your ground connections. Now you'll notice that I don't have a ground here and I have one here. These two are actually bonded together. And so in order to prevent creating a grounding loop, because they're going to the same grounding system in my AC panel, from what I have read and seen through research and through comments in the forum, you don't want to create a grounding loop by having both of these hooked up. So I have one of these hooked up, but both of these are grounded together. This is completely grounded by having one of these cables going to my main panel. One other thing to note, and I had heard comments on this as well, but it seems like they are no longer including the bonding screw in these inverters. So that means that anybody using these inverters needs to make sure in whatever you're connecting your AC output to, that has a ground to neutral bond already in it. In my scenario, my ground neutral bond, because of how everything I have wired, my ground neutral bond is, you know, back at my main panel. But for most people setting this up completely off grid, you set up your two inverters in split phase, you would want your sub panel where you have your two AC outputs combined, you would want your ground neutral bond in there. for completely off-grid, no AC input connection whatsoever. But you do need to make sure that you are including your own ground neutral bond now, because that screw is no longer inside the units. My warranty sticker is, our manufacturer sticker, won't focus. There we go. October 2022. I know I have seen the July 2022s had the bonding screw. The July 2022s also had the new block here. But the Junes, the ones that I had gotten back, my original ones from June, had the old terminal, and they did have a bonding screw as well. So for those of you getting newer models, or newer revisions, I should say, when you get your unit, you will definitely want to take your multimeter and check for continuity between your ground and your neutral on your AC output. These units have dynamic bonding to where on AC output, on the older units, the ground neutral bond would be enabled. But when it switched over to the AC input for grid bypass, that ground neutral bond would be disabled, so that it would use the bond coming from your main panel. So just, again, be aware. So as you've probably already seen, some of the changes that have been made from my end, I went through and I replaced all these conduits here. You know, I had the blue EMT, and then even in the PVs, I did not have anything. The PV wires were just kind of dangling out all over the place. And if you saw the earlier video, you know, Ian and I had gone through and replaced all the PVC with EMT. Got them all in this nice box. And then they pass through into the wireway and come straight up into these inverters. A much cleaner look. I really didn't want to mess with the EMT, but I came to discover when I went to remove my old units that taking the EMT or the ENT, the blue ENT out because of what I had bought was a pain. So I had these, and these snap in. And these are great if you're not planning on ever removing them. They have threaded options to where you can do the same thing right here. You put your lock washer on it and screw it down, but it was a little more expensive, and I didn't buy those because I was cheap. So I'm paying for it right now because this was a pain to pull out. Having to cut these tabs out basically so that I could get it to slide out and release from the inverter. So that was one of the things that kind of pointed me in the route of using the metal, obviously because I did it for the solar lines. You know, I thought, well, why not? One observation that I did make when I was adding these in is these solar, what do you want to call them? Ports, grommet slots, whatever. If you look closely, they do not line up with the jacks on the inside of the inverter. And so that was a little tricky, having to have the PV lines come up and then jog over a little bit. So be aware when you're trying to do that. You're going to need a pair of needle nose pliers to get up in here and guide your PV lines directly into these jacks here. But got all the EMT in. We've got our grounding bushings on the top and the bottom to keep from rubbing and chafing in here. You know, we've got our ground bar in here so that our wireway is grounded. All of our metal is grounded to our main ground line. And overall, I like it. It just looks a whole lot cleaner. And actually, down here, I actually went through and rewired all this that was a day in and of itself. After that last video of discovering my power flow problem with my smart shunt, it took me a while to figure out how I could properly orient everything and get it running so that all my power was running through the smart shunt. Now, obviously, I could have bought another one of these bus bars, but I really didn't want to at the current time. So I have it all terminating. My battery's terminating over here. In the event that I end up getting another set of batteries, obviously you can't add another lug on here, so I will be getting another bus bar for the battery connections before the smart shunt. But for the time being, I'll run it like this. But tried to get everything cleaned up. I still have to put some wire ties and stuff on here just to button everything up a little bit more. You can see coming up into the wireway, we've got our cable clamps holding the cables together. So all in all, I am very pleased with the changes that we've made. Ian and I spent quite a bit of time working on this stuff, and I'm happy. I did end up using that new knockout tool, the hydraulic knockout tool for these. So I told you I was going to show you a little bit more about how that works. So I'm going to show you a video that I took while I was cutting out these holes over here, so you can see just how smoothly and how easily that tool works. So these two 1-inch were already drilled in beforehand from the way that I had the inverter set before, and I had the blue conduit, the ENT, coming up from here, and they're already 1-inch. My battery connections over here, the holes were actually in the wrong spot, so I have to move them back. I'm actually going to try something this time. I don't know if it's going to work or not. On the other one, I had to take tin snips and actually cut the circle out. I want to see if I can actually use the crimping tool and see if it will cut through this as well, seeing as this is much thinner metal than the actual wireway. But so the way it works, you have to take and pre-drill your holes for this threaded piece, which actually feeds down through. And since these are going to be 1-inch holes, you have your actual cutting die, which goes underneath, and you thread the rod into that. You want to make sure that you have the points up, because this is actually what's doing the cutting. The hydraulic tool is actually going to pull this up into itself and actually pull the teeth into the metal. So you've got your cutting piece on the bottom, thread it down in, and I typically thread it most of the way. And then you have your I don't really know what the different pieces are called. This is kind of the receiver for the cutter. So you slide that on top, and then you've got your tool itself. I'm going to try and do this without dropping stuff, because this does not want to move very well. I wish that this would spin easy, but it doesn't. If it spun easy, then it would make handling this a whole lot simpler. Get it fairly snug. That way it doesn't take much pumping. Make sure we have it to pump, the pump turned on. Oh, there's the cut. Well, that didn't work like I was hoping. It just kind of pinched it up inside it. But it did cut this hole nice and smooth. Yeah, it ended up bending that up. as opposed to cutting it. And I'm assuming that's because I'm cutting from the bottom and not cutting from the top. So we'll try this again on this one. Turn on the pump. And that time, it actually did cut this, which is nice. And then these fit right down inside. So I'm very happy with how that knockout tool worked. I think the only complaint that I really had was that head is really oriented one way, so when you try to push it down, you've got to get that short hydraulic hose in the right spot, otherwise it wants to flip and roll on you. But other than that, it worked great. I ended up making just a cardboard template of the bottom of these units before I sent my old ones back, so that I could figure out exact placement for all of the holes that I need to make. And then I even spaced out away from the wall just a little bit, because if you look at this template here, you can see these battery connections. Boy, they're so close to the edge. So I ended up spacing them out away from the wall just a little bit. It means that I did have to shim these away from the wall a little bit, but it gave me more surface area to work with on the top of this wireway. So I'm happy. Everything looks great, looks clean. I've got to get a ton of labeling done still. I've got to go through now and retest pretty much all of the tests that I had problems with. So I have to keep an eye on, the grid dropout issue that I was having, flickering lights. I can't even think of some of the other issues that I was having. But I need to go back through and keep an eye out on all of those issues and see, with these inverters, they're not newer models, but newer revisions of the inverter. These are on the latest firmware. So supposedly, based on what I've seen in the forums, the latest firmware is supposed to fix at least a handful of some of these issues, including the flickering. So lots to watch. I still want to add more stuff into my combiner sub panel and do some tests and check my well out and get the furnace moved over, now that I've figured out how to backfeed this panel in the event that I have to take these units out. It's not ideal. I still would love to do some kind of a manual transfer switch to let me switch between grid and the inverters, but due to the spacing and where everything's wired, it's not the easiest for me to do. I got a lot of thinking to do in regards to that. All right, so before I let you go, I wanted to show you one little trick that I finally figured out how to make it work properly, and that revolves around starting the units up without using a pre-charge resistor. All right, so we've got everything buttoned up and ready to go. And I'll add again, I hate these tiny little screws on the side. They are such a pain and they strip out very easily. Don't ever use a power tool with these, because you're gonna strip them out. Use a hand screwdriver. But that's beside the point. That was free. So you can see here, everything's turned off. You don't see any light on my buck converter. You don't see any light down here on my shunt, and that's because my batteries are disconnected. Now, because of the capacitors in the inverters, if I were to turn those on, there'd be such an inrush that it would probably trip my BMSs. And it's done that in the past. Especially having two of these inverters, the inrush is significant. I haven't measured it, but it's enough to trip my BMSs. So in the past, I tried to fart around with a pre-charge resistor, and I still have them sitting over here on my bench. But that required me to either, manually jumper from over here to the bus bar or take the cover off here. And I talked about, putting a pre-charge button on the side of the battery box. And I have yet to find a decent push button or toggle switch that I can use for 48 plus volts. And to be honest, I kind of stopped looking when I figured out this little trick. So I've got my bench power supply, and we'll get it all plugged in. It's all turned off right now. So I'm gonna roll the voltage and make sure the voltage is all the way down to nothing. So we'll turn it on. You can see right now voltage is at nothing. So I'm gonna turn that back off. This is only a 5 amp power supply, so it's not gonna supply a ton of amps regardless. So we'll get it plugged in, red to red, black to black. We're gonna take our negative and we're gonna clip it right in here on one of the studs on my negative bus bar. And we're gonna take the positive and do the same on one of the screws right here on the positive bus bar. So remember, you've got the voltage all the way down, and that's important. You want it all the way off. And I know my batteries right now are at 52.8. And see, there's actually still 3 volts in these capacitors because I had shut them all off and drained them all out. And you see it's slowly dropping still. But so I want to take this up to the voltage that I know my batteries is at. And my batteries are at, like I said, 52.8. So we're going to dial the voltage up. $52.9, and so you watch the watts. It's slowly dropping. And for me, because I have the buck converter and I have the spark shunt, it's going to kind of level out at a specific spot. And once it levels out, then I know that these inverters have had their capacitors pre-charged. And so you can see it's kind of bouncing between 0 and, 1/1000th of an amp. Just enough for these 2 pieces here to power up. And when I see that, then I can come over, turn on my batteries, and I know that my units are completely pre-charged, no problems at all. And now you can see, as soon as I turn my batteries on, now it's trying to pump 57 watts into my batteries. But no pre-charge resistor needed, nothing. Just use my bench power supply, which is probably always going to stay over here anyways. But honestly, I don't really imagine that I'm going to be shutting these down to the point that I need to pre-charge stuff all the time. I thought that was a neat trick. I saw that first on Jehu Garcia's channel. He went through and was working on a battery pack and talking about how not to have your typical spark that you have. And then I also saw Andy on the Off-Grid Garage talk about it as well on his channel. So great tip, great suggestion, where you don't need to have that pre-charge resistor. And in fact, if you're building your own battery packs, you're already going to have a desktop power supply anyways. So why not use that to charge those capacitors and prevent that huge spark that you get all the time if you did not pre-charge them. So with that, I'm gonna let y'all go. I'm excited to get things back to where they were. I'm excited to get back to testing. It seems like it's been way too long. Lots more to do. If you saw my picture that I posted on my little community page, I have another project in the works that I am slowly gathering parts and pieces for. I'm not gonna spoil it if you didn't see it. I'll just save that for another day. But with that, I'm going to let y'all go. Y'all stay safe, stay warm, and we'll catch up with you later.